The struggle for civil rights in America has been a defining element of the nation's history. From the abolitionist movements of the 19th century to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and the ongoing fight for racial justice, gender equality, and LGBTQ+ rights today, civil rights activism has continually reshaped the legal and social landscape of the United States. While past movements focused on dismantling segregation and ensuring equal rights under the law, contemporary challenges involve systemic inequities, police brutality, and voting access. Despite these evolving struggles, one constant remains: the role of grassroots activism in shaping social justice. This article explores the evolution of civil rights in America, comparing past movements to current challenges, and examining how grassroots activism continues to drive progress. The earliest civil rights movements in America were rooted in the abolitionist struggle to end slavery. Throughout the early 19th century, activists such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison worked to expose the brutal realities of slavery. Abolitionists used newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches to rally support, while the Underground Railroad provided enslaved individuals a path to freedom. The culmination of these efforts was the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and the subsequent passage of the 13th Amendment, 1865, which formally abolished slavery. However, the end of slavery did not mark the end of racial oppression. During the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, the federal government implemented laws to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans, including the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. Despite these legal advances, resistance from white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, led to widespread voter suppression and racial violence. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jim Crow laws institutionalized racial segregation in the South, effectively reversing many of the gains made during Reconstruction. African Americans were subjected to discriminatory laws that restricted voting rights, employment opportunities, and public accommodations. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision, 1896, upheld segregation under the separate but equal doctrine, further entrenching systemic racism. The modern civil rights movement, 1950s to 1960s, emerged as a direct response to the systemic discrimination and violence against African Americans. Led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and John Lewis, the movement used nonviolent protests, legal challenges, and grassroots organizing to challenge racial segregation and discrimination. Key milestones of the movement included Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956. Sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest, this year-long boycott led to the desegregation of Montgomery's public transit system. The March on Washington, 1963. Over 250,000 people gathered to demand equal rights, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned segregation in public places and prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices, such as literacy tests and poll taxes, which had been used to disenfranchise black voters. The civil rights movement not only achieved significant legislative victories, but also demonstrated the power of grassroots activism in challenging systemic oppression. Community organizing, sit-ins, freedom rides, and mass demonstrations were crucial in pressuring lawmakers and raising public awareness about racial injustice. While the civil rights movement of the 1960s achieved major legal reforms, many of the issues it sought to address persist in new forms. Today, racial disparities in policing, mass incarceration, voting rights, and economic inequality continue to disproportionately affect communities of color. 1. Police brutality and the criminal justice system. The deaths of Michael Brown, 2014, Eric Garner, 2014, Breonna Taylor, 2020, and George Floyd, 2020, reignited national protests against police brutality and systemic racism in law enforcement. The Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, founded in 2013, has led calls for police reform, increased accountability, and an end to racial profiling. 2. Voter suppression and voting rights. Despite the Voting Rights Act of 1965, modern tactics such as voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, and gerrymandering disproportionately impact communities of color. The Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, weakened the Voting Rights Act by eliminating federal oversight in states with a history of discrimination, leading to new restrictions on voting access. 3. LGBTQ+ rights and gender equality. The fight for LGBTQ+ rights saw significant victories with the legalization of same-sex marriage in Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015, and the expansion of anti-discrimination protections. However, issues like transgender rights, workplace discrimination, and healthcare access remain contentious. 4. Economic and racial inequality. The racial wealth gap continues to widen, with Black and Hispanic families having significantly less wealth than white families. Disparities in education, housing, and employment opportunities contribute to ongoing inequality. Throughout American history, grassroots activism has played a vital role in pushing for civil rights reforms. Today, social media, digital organizing, and community-led initiatives have transformed activism, making it more accessible and far-reaching. Social media as a tool for activism. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok have amplified marginalized voices and mobilized global support for movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and climate justice. Viral campaigns and hashtags, e.g., hashtag Justice for George Floyd, hashtag Say Her Name, have increased awareness and accountability. Local organizing and mutual aid networks. Community-based organizations provide legal aid, voter education, and direct support to marginalized groups. Grassroots activists work on police reform, environmental justice, and workers' rights at the local and state levels. Protests and direct action. Nationwide protests following the murder of George Floyd led to policy discussions on defunding police departments and reallocating resources to social services. Strikes and walkouts have been used to demand fair wages, reproductive rights, and immigration reform. The fight for civil rights in America has evolved over centuries, with each generation facing new challenges while drawing inspiration from past movements. From the abolitionist struggle to the civil rights movement, and today's battles for racial, gender, and economic justice, grassroots activism has remained the cornerstone of change. Although significant progress has been made, systemic inequalities persist, necessitating continued activism, legal reforms, and community engagement. As history has shown, real change comes from the collective efforts of those willing to challenge injustice and demand a better future.